¿Cómo te llamas? Probably the first question you learned in Spanish class. But have you ever really thought about what goes into a name? What we're going to look at are first names and last names of Spanish speakers and what happens when people get married and have kids. But before we go, let me just say this. What you're about to see represents a traditional view of naming conventions of many, but not all, Spanish-speaking populations. And people, just like language, are always changing, which allows for variations and exceptions to everything that I'm about to present. So if you're out in the world and someone says it differently, that's okay. That's life. Alright, first things first. First names. Nombre. And this can be referred to as your nombre de pila, which would be your name of the font, your baptismal font, so where you were baptized, or your primer nombre, your first name. Well, the Catholic Church has had a very strong influence on the development over the centuries of the Hispanic world. And so names many times reflect the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, Jesus, the saints, or other theological beliefs. Names may also reflect regional, historical, or familial traditions. Okay, so a couple examples. Jesus, right, Jesus, Jose, Joseph would be influences of the Catholic Church, or Pedro, which would be Peter, the first pope, and one of the disciples. Fernando, for example, was given, the name was given to someone to honor King Ferdinand. Or maybe they decided to name the oldest son, which is typical, after the father. So Juan and Juan Jr. So many times the son would go by Junior. Female or women's names work the same way. So Maria, Mary, is probably the most common name in Latin America, with a lot of variations of Maria. Natividad, nativity, concepcion, which means conception, which would refer to the Immaculate Conception. Another thing that we have, again, are regional influences. And so if we look at Xochitl, which means flower, which comes from Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. So this is a fairly common name in Mexico. So all of these things influence the way people choose first names for their kids. So the second part then would be last names, or apellidos. Spanish speakers generally have two last names. The first last name comes from the dad, the second last name comes from the mom, and we usually use the letter Y, E, which means and in Spanish, to connect those two. Now sometimes people don't use and, they might use a dash. Sometimes they might just leave it out altogether. Sometimes people leave out the mom's last name. Sometimes people use the first initial of the mom's last name. What we're going to look at is probably the most common and the most traditional. If you were to go to a phone book, though, and you needed to find a name, you'd want to look it up from the paternal name or the dad's name. Okay, first things first. First name, Diego. First name, Julia. Two last names. Diego uses an and, E, in his name, where Julia has decided that she uses a hyphen. The dad's name, or the paterno, the apellido paterno, which comes from the papa, is the first one, Gonzalez y Huerta. And the apellido materno, which comes from the mama, is Garcia and Peña. How do I remember the order? Well, I think like 10:30 p.m. P.M. Papa, mama, paterno, materno. Just helps me remember. So a few common last names that we have here: Fernandez, Sanchez, Rojas, Martinez. Names that end in EZ mean son of. So Sanchez would be the son of Sancho. Hernandez would be the son of Hernando. Zapatero, for example, would indicate a profession of that lineage. So zapato, shoe, this person would have been a shoemaker or a cobbler. Another thing we need to keep in mind are spellings of last names. So let's look at Gonzalez and Gonzalez. These are two distinct last names. This is not the same last name. One has a written accent and a Z at the end. The other just has an S at the end. So your last name could be Gonzalez Gonzalez. So really pay attention to spelling. Let's look at a few examples. All right, so one day, Diego Gonzalez y Garcia is out and about, and he is in the Zocalo, He's just sitting on a park bench, and he sees Julia Huerta y Peña, and it is amor a primera vista. It is love at first sight, and he marries her. And then they are known as Los Gonzalez, the Gonzalezes, if you would, in English. Like the Smiths, so we would say Los and then the last name. And when they get married, Julia's name changes. Her new name is Julia Huerta de, so of, and then her husband's last name. Not everybody does this, but a lot of people do. And Diego and Julia have a child, Carlos Gonzalez y Huerta. First name Carlos, two last names. So Gonzalez comes from the dad, the apellido paterno, and Huerta comes from the mom, the apellido materno. Let's look at another example. Juan Velera Jimenez and Maria Vega Lopez. They get married, and they would be known as Los Velera. Maria would then be known as Maria Vega de Velera, and they have a child. So one name will come from the dad, and one name will come from the mom. And so their daughter, in this example, would be Luisa Velera Vega. Now we notice that this family decided not to use the and between the two last names, and that's their choice. And one day, the son, Carlos, is in the Zócalo, just like his dad was 30 years ago, and Carlos sees Luisa, and it is amor a primera vista. He is flechado. He has been arrowed. He is love-struck, and he proposes right then and there. And they get married. But Luisa's a little more modern, and she doesn't want to be Luisa Velera de Gonzalez, and so she keeps her name just how it is. And they have a child, and again, you have a nombre paterno, apellido paterno, and an apellido materno. And the child's name is Jesus Gonzalez y Velera. Jesus after an uncle who is also named Jesus. But so that no one gets confused, they decide to call the son by a nickname. And the nickname for Jesus is Chewy. Alright, so you know how I told you there was exceptions to everything? I'm going to give you a pretty big exception. Pablo Picasso, the painter, you know who he is, right? This was his baptismal name. Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno María de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso. From his dad was Ruiz, and from his mom was Picasso. But as a painter, he chose to go by Pablo Picasso, honoring his mother's lineage. Apellidos. There's a lot to it. Alright, that's all I got. I figure, the best way to really learn this is just go out and talk to people. I mean, isn't that why you're studying Spanish anyway? And if you do decide to get married, you got a lot of options. Suerte.